This is Left Hand, and I am your host, Sereptie, aka Craig from the Asset Horizon podcast. Today marks the first interview on my personal channel, and I wanted to offer something extra to the early subscribers of Left Hand. And if you're watching this in early August 2024, you are probably one of my early supporters. So, right from the get go, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone already on board and the many more of those to come. Now, my first series of lectures on the channel are on Bataille's theory of fascism. And so I wanted to bring in an ancillary discussion, perhaps useful to thinking through some of Bataille's claims. And the topic in focus is the so called irrationalism of Nietzsche, and the more relevant question of, in the absence of God, universal reason, or any other sort of cosmic mandate, can we truly justify our lives? Today, I'm happy to be joined by friend and sometimes collaborator and the co host of the podcast Moral Minority, Devin Gouré, who is a very experienced researcher on the work of Nietzsche. Recently, Devin wrote a blog post on his Substack, Methods of Madness, entitled On an Aesthetic Justification of Existence, Knowledge, Art, and Suffering in the Economy of Life, which approaches the aforementioned themes. As the title indicates, Nietzsche's relevant work here cuts across various domains of life, from our shared relationship with art to our existence as political beings. But given this is Devin's work and this is a new channel, I think I'm going to have Devin reintroduce himself to the many people who already know him, but also to present himself to a new audience. So, Devin, it's good to speak with you again, and we'd love to hear about who you are, your work, your podcast, and the purpose of your blog.
Great. Thanks, Craig. I appreciate you having me on. I am probably best known by my Twitter handle, Left Nietzschean, for my provocative posting on Nietzsche and hopefully also substantive threads on various topics in Nietzsche's philosophy. But my background is so I currently work primarily on Nietzsche. I'm working on a project on Nietzsche that's really focused on Nietzsche from a psychological standpoint, reading his philosophy through his experiences of madness and also his lifelong struggles with sickness, connects a lot to Pierre Klossowski's work on Nietzsche. In terms of my background, though, when I got my PhD, I wasn't working on Nietzsche at the time. I got my PhD in political theory, and the topic I worked on actually kind of relates in a weird way to what the topic you've chosen for this session, and also the post that I wrote, just in this kind of general convergence on the theme of aesthetics. At the time, I was really interested in some of this work on political judgment that was analogizing political judgment to aesthetic judgment. This primarily came out of Hannah Arendt in her lectures on Kant's political philosophy. But there are other sources for this kind of theme. Philosophical hermeneutics and thinkers like Gadamer was another source of inspiration for me. In each case, the intuition was that aesthetics in the modern sense, when it becomes this sort of independent field, separate from ethics or metaphysics or what have you, becomes detached from this deeper practical and moral import that art and aesthetics previously had. In fact, the very term aesthetics is traceable to the late 18th century, and Alexander Baumgarten. And at the time, I was interested in some of these works on the intersection between aesthetics and politics, with trying to negotiate this kind of paradox or this difficulty where aesthetics could offer useful vocabulary and conceptual forms for thinking about forms of political struggle, political judgment and deliberation, but also carry this danger that Walter Benjamin discusses famously in the work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, that fascism consisted in the aestheticization of politics. So that there's this danger of fascist irrationalism that might come from joining politics and aesthetics. And so I was interested in my dissertation in kind of working out a more comprehensive theory of political judgment based on this kind of mode of aesthetic validity. And it's something that while I didn't end up publishing, and have not yet published a dissertation, and after leaving academia, my work has gone in a different direction. It still provides this background for how I think about Nietzsche's concept of an aesthetic justification for existence, which also shares this kind of deep intuition about the existential importance of art and beauty, that relegating these activities or these phenomena to this kind of specialized activity in human life circumscribes the importance they could have for us, or in some ways severs them from their more profound and existential roots and how they relate to human existence.
The chief sentence in focus here today is Nietzsche from The Birth of Tragedy, writing, "Only as aesthetic phenomenon is existence eternally justified." And you've given us some of the general contours of the problematic, at least after Nietzsche. But could you give us the broader scope? Like, what led Nietzsche to this particular problem? What is he reacting to? And why do you think this question remains important?
Yeah, so the phrase that only is an aesthetic phenomenon is existence eternally justified comes from Nietzsche's first published work, The Birth of Tragedy. And so it represents in important ways an early manifestation of his thought that's still tied to the deep influence of Schopenhauer and Wagner, and something that he'll challenge and reformulate at different times throughout his life. But it represents a fundamental concern for the role that art plays in justifying certain aspects of existence that we find intolerable, particularly the existence of intolerable suffering, or also limits to our understanding. The sense that, and this is something that Nietzsche describes famously in The Birth of Tragedy through the wisdom of the satyr Silenus, who's a follower of Dionysus, who the story that he relates is Silenus is pursued by King Midas through the woods, and when Midas catches him, he asks what the best thing is for man, for humankind. And Silenus responds, "Why do you ask me that? The best thing for humankind is never to have been born, to be nothing, and the second best thing by far is to die soon." And for Nietzsche, this expresses not just this elements of sort of passionate Dionysian madness that he finds in tragedy, but also this tragic wisdom or tragic knowledge, that there's some deep limitation to our knowledge in our ability to grapple with the world existentially through the means supplied by knowledge rather than, say, faith or art. And The Birth of Tragedy really explores these limits through the opposition of Apollo and Dionysus as two different elements of art, two different art principles, but also through a kind of opposition between art and science. Where science, or modern science, and also Socrates, for Nietzsche, represent a kind of optimistic faith in the capability of knowledge, human knowledge and reason, to not only know the world as it really is, and its kind of innermost essence, but also a faith that knowledge aligns with human morality and human goodness. Not only that increasing knowledge of the world makes you more virtuous, but also that we're kind of guaranteed in advance in some fashion not to encounter a deep metaphysical truth that runs counter to our own existing conception of the highest good. And this will be a persistent theme in Nietzsche's thought, that he'll criticize philosophers for engaging in a kind of involuntary autobiography where they've just sought to justify their own kind of pre-existing commitments in this regard. But in Birth of Tragedy, he has a really stark opposition between art and science. And art is what becomes necessary when science reaches its limits. When our optimistic quest to know the world through rational means fails in the face of some kind of terrible truth that we can't incorporate. Art is then the medicine that heals the wound created by our failed project of understanding. And in early Nietzsche, this kind of dialectic is inescapable. Life itself, in some fashion, rests on artistic illusions, has to create an artistic illusion of the world in order to tolerate suffering. And while this kind of thesis is not worked out in Birth of Tragedy, which is focused more on the history of tragedy, history of aesthetics, Nietzsche will start to develop a more general theory, even in his early notebooks, about how art and beauty function within the overall economy of life. Life as always exposed to suffering, always vulnerable to threats, requiring knowledge in order to understand and anticipate threats to its own existence, but also requiring art in order to redeem its suffering, in order to prevent it from becoming a memory of trauma that sort of festers painfully as a kind of bad conscience, constricts action going forward. And all of these concerns are already there in Birth of Tragedy.
So, one important piece in all of this is the role of pain in the formation of our consciousness, our sense of rational agency. And I think for Nietzsche, pain as that which allows us and allows societies to construct a sense of subjectivity. And I'm talking about, of course, the little nudges that we receive on a day-to-day basis, whether it's feedback from our parents, our peers, and so forth. Sometimes those nudges are quite forceful, but at the same time, it's that same pain. It's that same beyond of that which we believe we can contain and control within a sense of rationality that also contributes to an aesthetic understanding of ourselves. And so I'd like you to talk about the role of pain in Nietzsche's work, but also more specifically, what marks the difference between the kind of pain that forces us to become subjects and that which is the impetus towards an aesthetic life?
Great question, particularly, I think, that last distinction, because I think that's a point where we're going to be able to criticize Nietzsche in terms of whether he's able to kind of adequately distinguish between uh, rationalizing pain away versus actually coming up with a coherent and plausible explanation for pain that will somehow satisfy us in the future in a meaningful way. This is obviously one of his deep concerns, though. But Nietzsche has a fairly well fleshed out theory. People who have read The Genealogy of Morals will probably be familiar with some parts of this argument. At the beginning of the second essay of the genealogy, Nietzsche gives a genealogy of the origins of conscience and what he calls the sovereign individual, that is centered around this operative idea of pain and torment, and that comes from sort of inscribing commands on the flesh of the body and the mind. And I think this connects to that, kind of already calls attention to this crucial connected concept to pain for Nietzsche, which is memory. Pain will always be for Nietzsche connected with some fundamental function of memory that, again, is a kind of universal function of organic life, that traces of pain have to be retained in order to later in the future master the cause of pain. And he'll comment in a way that I think is still indebted to Schopenhauer. This is in the Gay Science. I think aphorism 13. He makes it's an aphorism called On the Feeling of Power. He makes a comment that pain always leads to a question of why, or some question as to the cause. Whereas pleasure, we're happy to kind of just enjoy the moment of pleasure and not worry too much about what its source is until maybe the pleasure fades and it's replaced by the pain of its absence. Pain instead forces the mind out of itself, while also forcing the mind inward. So I think it's this double movement that makes it so important in the formation of subjectivity for Nietzsche. On the one hand, pain directs us towards this proto-rational structure of an understanding of causality. On the other hand, it directs us back towards ourselves in the formation of some kind of memory and the trace of the pain and a scar of some kind, right? And this carries this attendant danger where, on the one hand, the memory forms this enduring knowledge of the pain's cause, but on the other hand, it also allows us to kind of resurrect the pain yet again, to cause pain to ourselves imaginatively, just in our kind of interiority, by remembering the source of pain that we've preserved. So memory carries this basic risk. And for Nietzsche, what distinguishes, and if we follow the account in the second essay of the genealogy, there's a kind of decisive break that happens in human prehistory for him, where through the deliberate creation of these practices of inflicting pain for the sake of building a memory, the human rational faculty sort of becomes hypostasis. It detaches itself from the rest of the instincts and grows into this overgrown giant faculty that dominates all of the rest of human affective and desiring life, let's say. And this is the product of this long history of creating a memory that it inflicts or it creates the sort of regularity and predictability that is necessary for the human animal to learn how to make promises, right? Nietzsche's kind of basic intuition is that in order for me to keep a promise as this kind of basic function of civilization, this basic function of society, I have to have the faith that I will remain the same person, right, long enough to keep the promise, that I have to have it as my expectation that my human nature is no longer so changeable that I expect to be some totally different transfigured person at the moment that it comes time to keep my promise. Nietzsche's intuition is that we can't take that for granted. In fact, that entire predictability and regularity of human nature had to be cultivated through this entire history of pain, as it were. And this history of cruelty is at the root of our original kind of moral intuitions, moral sensations, and judgments. And this is, part of the purpose of Nietzsche's genealogy is to reveal these disturbing and unsettling origins in what we might take to be our loftiest and most ideal concepts, namely those of moral goodness.
Yeah, maybe we could venture a little bit of an example on that. Like, how does this cash out in everyday life? An example that comes to mind for me is someone who, when by themselves, might speculate upon or imagine obligations that they have made to others that they truly haven't made in any sense. And maybe they're a bit worrisome or neurotic about it. What does Nietzsche see as some primary examples of somebody who's overcome by this excess?
I think that Nietzsche, and this is a theme that I think goes back to his early work and particularly comes up in Schopenhauer as educator. I think forces of shame and self-loathing are an essential aspect of what he will describe as bad conscience in the genealogy of morals. So shame, as it just kind of have the way as it operates as a kind of ethical emotion, is built around a sense of self failure, or a failure of power, a loss of power, in particular the loss of power to be the person that you ethically expected yourself to be. And I think what Nietzsche describes in Bad Conscience in the genealogy is how an ethically productive kind of function of shame morphs into a function of guilt that is unproductive. That rather than directing us towards some kind of meaningfully higher ideal that would give shape to our aspirations, instead forces us into a position where we're always lesser than or always failing in relation to the moral ideal that we're living up to. I mean, I think anybody who has a Christian upbringing, I think, particularly if you're Catholic. Personally, I was brought up in a Protestant church before I, rejected my religion, as a typical Nietzschean does, in your teen years. But the sense that you're guilty by virtue of some law that isn't fully explicable to you, right? That no longer seems to be intelligible, but might have to be given by some sort of revelation. And I think this gets back to the central point, not just like moral guilt in this, I think the one predominant one would be guilt that people feel over sexuality and whether it's your sexual identity, whether it's sexual acts that you have done. That would be guilt that Nietzsche would see by it as entirely unnecessary, right? Because one thing that he does seem to align with many left-wing things and aspects of left-wing politics on is this idea of kind of liberated sexuality. Constrictions on sexuality and sexual identity seem to be really anathema to the Dionysian spirit that he's trying to capture. But certainly the way that sexuality is maligned in the Christian religion and a kind of false guilt is generated, and self-loathing is generated. I think this is basically how I think what Nietzsche would trying to show us in a way that's deeply provocative and also kind of designed to destabilize our feeling of comfort with whatever morals we've inherited, is to suggest that this kind of structure of unnecessary guilt is much more pervasive in human life than we really give it credit for. That when we feel ourselves to have failed in relation to our desired career in the capitalist system, this also is another version of the kind of Christian aestheticism, an aesthetic ideal that infers wrongly a kind of inadequacy of someone's failed choices, when in fact we don't have it. For Nietzsche would say, we don't have any such free will. We're wrongly kind of judging ourselves. This, of course, has other deeply disturbing and worrying implications. But this is the kind of psychological grip that he's trying to loosen, the false and unhelpful guilt. The sense that there is a treatment for the disease of human consciousness, and it being a disease in the sense that it risks preserving memories of pain to an extreme degree because we have because the human animal has cultivated this incredibly powerful memory, incredibly powerful rational capacity. The risk that comes with it is this ruminating, proliferating guilt over the smallest thing. So the example you gave would be, I think, a good example of how the mind imaginatively creates, threats or mistakes that it's made that don't exist, by this simply because it has that capacity in some sense. I can promise, right? And now I worry that I've entwined myself perhaps in a set of relationships, a set of obligations that maybe I can't fulfill. And I think Nietzsche would say that some pattern of thinking is like that is the dangerous underside of any kind of moral system, moral principle, moral code.
When I was younger, I was very much artistically inclined. I don't think much has changed since then, but I had a very specific experience of sometimes when I had either the canvas or the page in front of me, sometimes I would begin drawing or painting and I would be quite happy with what I would see. Maybe it would even embolden my ego in some ways, but then other times I would feel a sense of shame or strong doubt about what I was doing and I would crumple up the page and throw it away. And it's almost as if in those moments, the kind of moral apparatus or the ocean of shame would just come flooding in. It raises the question for me that there seems to be a kind of divide or a turnstile. I'm not sure what the metaphor here is that shows us a threshold between this moral sense of ourselves and this capacity for expressing ourselves artistically and the attitude and comportment of these two different modes are so radically different in some cases that it seems to suggest that there's some sort of shift that takes place that radically reconfigures who we are, at least in that moment. What does that look like on Nietzsche's terms? What does that affective shift look like?
Yeah, well, I think this is something that Nietzsche, as I mentioned before, that Nietzsche charts out as largely a prehistorical shift. And what you've described is the way in which I think it functions in everyday psychology. So what your example actually kind of maps on nicely to Nietzsche's description of the artistic process as a form of will to power. So in your initial experience, you had a kind of artistic inspiration. And it doesn't matter, we don't need to worry aesthetically about whether the art you were creating was good or bad, high quality or low quality. The point is that you had this urge to create that sort of overflowed and needed to be exerted, needed to express itself. And it attained gratification, the gratification it desired in that moment. You did, at least initially, put this onto the page and get some kind of enjoyment of the act of creation. But then some kind of function of moral judgment or faculty of moral judgment triggers a need to assign certain kinds of moral criteria of evaluation to the result. Not only to assign, moral criteria of evaluation, but even to take there to be a goal or telos, a result, the work as somehow the point, rather than the expression of power and creation that simply comes from the act of the process of artistic creation, right? That there is a basic shift that goes on there. And I think that for Nietzsche, this is something that, I think there are many different accounts, I think, of this kind of process of early rationalization in kind of ancient Greek myths. But I think that's the example that Nietzsche uses to kind of describe, if we want to kind of locate historically. It's very similar to Adorno and Horkheimer and Dialect of Enlightenment, for example, accounts that are, in their case, partially inspired by Weber, but accounts of this idea of some early emergence of rationality in kind of the 5th century BC onward up through kind of 1st century AD, kind of what Jaspers, I think what Jaspers calls the axial age, where you see the emergence of kind of great monotheistic religions, you see the emergence of more rationalized social structures. And one aspect of that Nietzsche points out very early on is processes of demythologization in ancient Greece through this kind of transition from myth through the pre-Socratics, who all contribute certain kind of like essential moments to demythologization in the direction of kind of abstract reason and philosophy, and ultimately then to Plato, to Socrates and Plato, as representing kind of finally the triumph of philosophy over myth, and in particular the triumph of an idea of the transcendent realm or transcendent ideals governing this immanent existence, rather than a kind of mythology of gods that are themselves immanent to the same existence or the same kind of plane as human beings. And I think that's the distinction that Nietzsche would draw between Greek mythology, where the aesthetic justification of existence in large part comes from this idea of the gods as beings that are not totally discontinuous with mortals and who can enjoy the kind of the foibles of mortals in their kind of both their folly and their greatness, as a kind of spectacle, and tragedy can sort of instantiate this for Nietzsche. But there's a distinction between that and a kind of Christian picture of the transcendent God that is ontologically distinct from this realm. And so I think, I'm sort of circling around what is this sort of essential break or this essential error that Nietzsche identifies. But it's this basic error of conceptual thought that it kind of catches, the human animal is caught in very early on, through which we feel the need through this kind of speculative moment of reason to project meaning into some kind of transcendent realm that we use then as a metric to judge the immanent realm, the merely apparent. That we open up some kind of distinction between the true world and the apparent world that by its very existence denigrates the apparent world, the one that we live in. And I think Nietzsche's claim is that some version of that error is implicit in the very development of human consciousness as such, but that it becomes intensified and becomes a real historical force with Christianity primarily.
I want to dig into the word justification. Maybe first to talk about the tragic. We live in a world where there's a seemingly boundless horizon of horrific possibilities. Bataille talks about the horror of liberty, that on any given day, your schedule can be disrupted by something like a massive car accident or an asteroid falling from the sky and absolutely obliterating everything you love with no reason whatsoever. So then my question is, what does justification mean in this context? And often those who cleave to Nietzsche's views, they'll come under the indictment of adopting something like a recklessness or a puerile attitude toward issues and problems in the world that have a seemingly inherent gravity to them, like political issues, for example. And it's often the case that those who might take on a sort of Nietzschean or a Bataillean view, for example, espouse a kind of libertinism or hedonism. Is that out of bounds for Nietzsche? Are all forms of radical free expression within the realm of aesthetic justification?
No, I think that is a misreading, and I mean I will note again. I noted before that this line we're referring to about the aesthetic justification of existence is in Birth of Tragedy, and his thoughts on this will evolve. So the closest he'll come to this kind of libertinism that you described would be the idea of the free spirit in his middle work. And here I think Nietzsche is toying with a more straightforward rejection of morality in a book like Human, All Too Human. That's a book that's really dedicated to this kind of natural scientific debunking of moral ideals and their presuppositions in the human soul, whether it's the free will or some concept of guilt and the moral notions of compassion and pity and so forth. And it's a little later, really, when you get to Dawn, that he gets into this more profound question of the value of values. What is the real function that morality plays in human life, and connects that back to this theme of the Birth of Tragedy about how art justifies existence. That in some sense, morality can be viewed as a form of art or a particular form of aesthetic justification that human animals adopted for their particular needs as the form of life that they are. And when it comes to the question of justification, no, I think it's a very good question, because there will always, the way I would put the objection is, there's the concern of saying, well, if you just aestheticize horrible injustices, right, just treat them as aesthetic spectacles, this seems to be the kind of barbaric behavior that, as we mentioned, Benjamin worried about, the fascist aestheticization of politics, just treating violence and war as kind of beautiful art objects. Does Nietzsche lead to this kind of dead end? I would argue that this significantly underrates the extent to which Nietzsche weighs the importance of the seriousness versus the light and the comic. So in one of the passages that I mentioned in the Substack post, he talks about the human animal's need for a justification for existence. The worry is that he would justify and would go on to justify great horror at great crimes, for example, on aesthetic grounds. I would argue that what Nietzsche is concerned about is the fact that we do find ourselves attached to these fundamentally serious justifications for existence. We can't, the idea of somehow engaging in the pure levity of some free spirit aesthetic reaction to tragedy, I think, misses the psychological dilemma that Nietzsche's work is really trying to respond to. What it's trying to respond to is one where we find ourselves kind of irrevocably, unavoidably caught up in the seriousness of a moral worldview. And we can't avoid, as the humans we are, feeling pangs of suffering in conjunction with in response to the injustices that we perceive. And in an important sense, Nietzsche's entire project, the entire idea of provoking us by presenting this so-called master morality that flies in the face of these internalized Christian virtues, would entirely fall flat if we didn't have a deep emotional attachment as human beings to those Christian virtues that have been inculcated for Nietzsche over 2,000 years, more or less. So it's really in the interplay of seriousness and the kind of seriousness versus comedy, of seriousness versus aesthetics. And you can't prize one apart from the other. So that would rule out, I think, the kind of pure libertine, the pure aesthetic position. We see in response to this that Nietzsche does favor oftentimes a harsh morality, not necessarily the one that not the one that's favored by Christianity, but one that does involve forms of self-discipline, serious self-discipline, that often does require taking something as profound as a profound existential goal that one is pursuing, that you place above yourself. You may even engage in aesthetic practices that outwardly look similar to those of Christian aesthetics, but is for the sake of some kind of greater production or creation or intensification of desire and life in this world, rather than for the sake of attaining some kind of afterlife and just thus in pure denigration of this world. So I do think that Nietzsche, in many cases, I think places in Twilight of the Idols, for example, does explicitly reject the kind of pure libertine aesthetic kind of position. But what he is posing is, I think, the deep limits of a quest to attain epistemic mastery over the universe, over the world, in a way that would guarantee our kind of moral intelligibility as human beings. What he's raising is the possibility that we live in a kind of only partially intelligible world, where our rational efforts to understand it will be successful up to a point, but will always reach their limits. And that isn't a failure of rationality. That represents somehow just the natural limits of rationality, and where it has to give way to something that doesn't necessarily conflict with it, but may complement it. And I think this is more the kind of picture that Nietzsche is getting at, that there is a point, particularly, and I think what he would argue, we as human beings necessarily in the search for justifications, in the search for why. So if I see genocide happening, for example, I think you and I agree is happening right now, I might be led to ask a question, not just about its justification in the political sense of like, why is this being allowed to happen? But I could also have an existential reaction to it, a deep foreboding and dread about the value of human existence if we're capable of doing this to each other, right? This is the kind of worry that Adorno had about the Holocaust. How do we justify human history in the face of like these kinds of crimes? And I think that there are moments of moral despair and moral and where our attempts to kind of develop a morality that fits with the world as it is reaches limits, and therefore requires the intervention of art and aesthetics or myth as something that can be interwoven with our rational understanding. I think that's more what Nietzsche is up to, rather than some kind of endorsement of pure irrationalism, for example. I think he's showing how the limits of reason, in some sense, demand the aesthetic as a complement.
You know, the insight that I'm going to walk away from this conversation with is that hedonism or libertinism as a reaction to the sort of overwrought morality, in a sense, is not only an inversion of the problem, but compounds it in a way because it takes its finger off the pulse of the tragic,
Right.
in the sense where we're not confronted with the ultimate exigency of that question.
And that's the key thing. I think Nietzsche, if there's one thing I think Nietzsche will insist on, it's that, I think is really the entire point of the eternal recurrence, is to pose this dilemma of meaninglessness and loss of intelligibility, the purposelessness of the world in the sharpest possible way, right, to initiate a kind of confrontation where we reach the lowest, the deepest possible abyss, out of a conviction that true affirmation only emerges from that confrontation. And the hedonist would be avoiding anything, not just avoiding the deepest abyss, but venturing into the abyss at all. It would be kind of the pure, so it would be, let's say, if Nietzsche said that the Greeks were superficial out of profundity in their tragedy, the hedonist would be the kind of pure superficiality, a superficiality that hasn't gone through the hard-won struggle with the profound things in existence in order to gain this kind of light, cheerful play of surfaces that can only come out of a deep suffering with the true nature of existence, not out of ignoring.
One of the statements that you have in your blog post, I want to read the quote. It's from The Gay Science. Nietzsche writes, "Man has gradually become a fantastic animal that must fulfill one condition of existence more than any other animal. Man must from time to time believe he knows why he exists. His race cannot thrive without a period trust in life, without faith in the reason in life." And given what we've said about aesthetic justification so far, my argument is that, well, implicit here, there's an idea of community or shared values that builds up around the question of the tragic, and that attends to all of our attempts at rationally explaining and even completely circumscribing the world. I think a fortiori, if we embrace an aesthetic existence, that compounds yet again a demand for a sense of community and shared values, in the sense that if we are to embrace whatever the totality in sort of Nietzsche's cosmodicy, not in the sense of like a philosophized rationality, that it would demand of us that we have an inclusive way of interacting with those in our community, and sharing and promulgating this value of the aesthetic justification of life. I'm wondering what you think about that, and what does Nietzsche think with respect to creating communities around this sense of aesthetic justification of life?
Yeah, it's a great question because I think one of the most persistent misunderstandings of Nietzsche is that he's some kind of simple ethical individualist. He really just cares about the isolated genius and solitude, scorns the masses, and really just cares and really doesn't have any interest in a kind of community building activity. I think that's incorrect. I think there's one of the things that's interesting about Nietzsche's writing is the way that it has an appeal to a certain kind of reader that he doesn't really seem to think exists, but he hopes exists. And there's a way in which we can read this as Nietzsche being selective of his audience, is to try and to kind of like cultivate a community of similar aesthetic free spirits. Or I think we can view it along the lines of the kind of dedication of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, a book for everyone and no one, which is that we're leaving open the question. In some sense, the ideal reader for Nietzsche, the philosopher of the future, doesn't exist in the present, is to come, is yet to be, and therefore is sort of undecidable between whether it's everyone or no one. We're kind of left as the reader to take up that question for and within ourselves in this kind of confrontation with Nietzsche's philosophy. But I think Nietzsche's philosophy is community building in the sense that it calls out to a kind of aesthetic philosopher reader that he's trying to challenge his readers to become in some sense. But I also think that there's also a kind of psychological and personal dimension of this. Nietzsche would often describe his writing as a process of seeking out friends. In Ecce Homo, he appeals to the metaphor in the Gospels of Christ saying that I will make you fishers of men, by describing his writing as fish hooks that are essentially designed to catch certain sorts of people. And I think this gets into some of the more interesting ambiguities and problematic aspects of Nietzsche, where I think there is a kind of community building project. And the question is what kind of status it should take. I think most readers of Nietzsche agree that is largely an aesthetic cultural project, that he often envisioned some kind of collective aesthetic undertaking where, the early model of this was, of course, Wagner's attempt in Bayreuth to create, to perform the Ring Saga and kind of institute this kind of tragic culture. Nietzsche, of course, rejected this, thought it was a total failure. But I think as some Nietzsche biographers like Julian Young argue, never really gave up this search for a kind of aesthetic community through which a collective art project could be realized. The difficult aspect of this is undoubtedly connected to Nietzsche's political thoughts on caste society and his search for a kind of radical aristocracy. There's no doubt he saw this kind of select group of aesthetic creators as a kind of new aristocracy. But I think it's left to us as readers of Nietzsche to try to follow the reasoning he is laying out in terms of why the quest, as we've been discussing, why a certain quest for knowledge and reason reaches its limits in some kind of aesthetic project, and ask whether, as you said, this would need to be a more inclusive project than Nietzsche envisioned. And these are kind of imminent critiques of Nietzsche that I think many democratic theorists have carried out. But I also think that from the standpoint of Nietzsche's own work, one of the flip sides of the fact that he consistently privileges the exception over the rule is to complicate this kind of aristocratic idea of strength, to recognize that the exception can never really be anticipated from the standpoint of the existing rule, right? And that no concept of natural inequality is, in some sense, instituting some stable hegemony of natural inequality would very much, from within the standpoint of Nietzsche's own system, risk doing exactly what he criticizes most human societies for doing, namely casting off and destroying their exceptions, their great geniuses that come from fundamentally unpredictable places that are usually created through the most chaotic and strange and unpredictable kind of combinations of affects and instincts. And one of Nietzsche's kind of defenses of modernity is that it's fertile ground for the creation of some kind of this future aesthetic genius in that sense, that modernity really brings into confrontation all of this kind of accumulated history of values and instincts. They're all kind of offered up in the marketplace, in the capitalist marketplace of modernity, and merged together. And Nietzsche, I think, very clearly sees this as opportunity. It's not this is a double-edged sword where, of course, he's condemning the movement of nihilism and decadence that has led us here. But I think in places like Beyond Good and Evil, it's also clearly the case that he sees it as exactly the kind of chaos that is likely to give birth to a dancing star that can break with that history of nihilism, right? And I think yeah, it's the question, like and that's the question I sort of personally, and still try to work out as somebody who's, it thinks that Nietzsche is best read as somebody who has insights for politics, but that we should not try to engage in a Nietzschean political project, but that there is a Nietzschean kind of aesthetic and cultural project that involves a form of political critique, while still existing sort of in agonism with and at the edges of politics, without necessarily being a form of political organization or action directly. And that's something that you see in the kind of modernist concept of an artistic avant-garde that like plays a kind of dialectical role within political movements. That's sort of the direction that I think of taking Nietzsche, and I think people are right to resist many of an explicitly Nietzschean politics in this sense, and we can continue to discuss the way these are connected. But I think my argument would be that his search for aesthetic community, his search for a kind of cultural community, is still responding to this basic need of the absence of kind of any overriding existential justification in modernity, that the collapse of a traditional religious form of justification, that the increasing collapse not only of moral forms of judgment, but even our ability to agree on objective reality, to agree on some kind of shared sensory reality. All of these kinds of capacities are degrading from an Nietzschean standpoint in modernity. And I think we can ask the legitimate question about whether modern rationalized society fulfills certain forms of spiritual need that are legitimate, and whether something like a Nietzschean aesthetic project is kind of the distinctively modernist way of addressing that kind of.
Yeah, I think this takes us to the question of fascism, the relationship between fascism and irrationalism. Fascism is a kind of irrationalism, as these terms are often uttered in the same breath. There's actually a lot of excellent books on this topic. I mean, I'm thinking of Male Fantasies by Klaus Televeit. Also, there's a book by Robert Paxton called The Anatomy of Fascism. And one of the things that really stood out to me in that book in particular was the comparison that the author Paxton makes between, for example, fascists and we'll say Marxists or communists or any other kind of leftist, for example, given that fascists and fascist movements tend to sever a libidinal attachment to things like philosophical critique, and rather prefer a kind of affective immediatism, the aestheticization of politics, as you said, that then power their movements. But then you have writers like Bataille and Artaud, who we were talking about before we hit record, who were big readers of Nietzsche, but also recognized that something about fascist movements had an incredible power to capture the imagination of large masses of people and transform culture in some way. And it was perhaps because they attended to things like mythology or mysticism. And we see Bataille in particular, but also Artaud going off into different places in the world. I think Bataille went to Italy, Artaud goes to Mexico, and they're both looking for this new reinvigoration of life via myth. I think in the case of Bataille, he goes off to Italy to read authors like Fraser, The Golden Bow, and all kinds of mythology. Artaud goes to indigenous Mexico, like I said. And what they want to do is somehow either hack or repurpose myth and mythology and bring it back into left wing movements to combat what they think are the excesses of real existing socialism of the time. And they're doing this under the auspices of a revival of Nietzsche's ideas. I'm curious about your opinion on this particular move made by Bataille and Artaud, and if you think there is any sort of positive aspect to it. Do you think a similar problem is playing out today? And do you think the creation of an avant garde, for example, could benefit from doing the kinds of projects that Bataille and Artaud were up to?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. There's a lot to say here, so I'm going to try to think of the order I want to go. I think let's start with the question of fascism and affect. And I think then we can kind of work our way to what distinguishes the kind of myth creating program of someone like Bataille and Artaud from the fascist mythos. So my background for thinking about a lot of these issues in fascism and their psychology, just based on my training, it comes out of the Frankfurt School, and thinkers like Adorno and Horkheimer, Marcuse. But it also comes out of Hannah Arendt and her reflections on the banality of evil, which I do think are widely misunderstood. But what a lot of these thinkers seize upon is what I take to be a kind of precondition for the immediacy of the like immersion in instinct and affect that fascism kind of solicits, requires, thrives on, which is kind of the suspension of the faculty of reflection. And Arendt sometimes presents this, in her infamous book on Eichmann, we have the kind of image of the idea of bureaucrat who's just kind of rubber stamping deaths that just appear as statistics on a page to him. I think what this kind of focus misses is an argument that she makes, that I think Adorno also makes, that there's sort of a process in which repeated experiences of anything from violence to aggressive stupidity and conformity lead to a kind of habit of suspending one's reflective faculty. When I was working on my dissertation in grad school, I was particularly interested in skepticism and cynicism as they function in this context. That there's a kind of psychological reaction. I think I take this to be very central to a lot of contemporary, like fascist and fascist-leaning movements. The kind of total rejection of morality in favor of a might makes right position, I think, comes out of a place of deep skepticism and cynicism, which says, well, I have these moral criteria that I know exist and I'm told are correct, but they don't apply to the world. What I see in the world is corruption. What I see is just not intelligible in terms of what morality promises. So here I have two options. I can try to regain my faith in morality through some kind of meaningful project of shaping the world to better align with what I take to be the demands of morality. But one alternative would be to withdraw my moral criteria from the world entirely. To say, well, if the concepts of morality don't describe the world, I'm going to stop using it. I'm going to shut down whatever mechanism of moral reflection is kind of habitually going on in response to situations. And a kind of psychological account that I think both Arendt and Adorno in different ways develop is this idea that by repeatedly and habitually suspending the rational faculty in that way, we also degrade the moral personality. We also degrade our ability to meaningfully recognize situations in light of moral principles as demanding moral response, and lose the ability to reason coherently about what our obligations are and how best to realize them. And I think to bring this back to Nietzsche, what I think really comes out particularly, and we talked about this in Moral Minority in one of our episodes on Dialect of Enlightenment, that suspension of the rational faculty is sort of the permission needed to enjoy the kind of return to barbarism, the kind of return to the unity of nature and surrender to instincts, particularly violent instinct. And what I had been trying to sort of hint at through Nietzsche, throughout this, with regards to Nietzsche, is that is a path that for Nietzsche is blocked to us, right? That the path to the Übermensch can't regress back to this pure animality. It couldn't regress back to some naive union with nature. And particularly in Nietzsche's middle work, after he rejects Wagner and the hope of some immediate aesthetic tragic renewal, it's quite clear that Nietzsche affirms the need to move through the discoveries of natural science, the discoveries of modern philosophy, and the enhancement of human knowledge and rationality that they bring with them. That any transfiguration of the human animal must push these to their limit in some fashion, rather than suspend them, arrest that process, and regress. And I think that would be the key distinction. That's what fascism does. And I think when viewed this way, fascism becomes a product of what the kind of psychology Nietzsche describes as the last man, right? I can't affirm hope in moral criteria in the world anymore, so I will succumb to despair as a something that licenses me to indulge my worst instincts, right? That's something that licenses me to engage in violence and to also engage in brute irrationalism, where I project, the source of my pain, the source of my suffering, because I'm unable to assign it an intelligible cause and reality, one that makes sense according to my kind of normative criteria. I can easily assign it to a scapegoat that provides an outlet for this newly released kind of impulse to brutality. And so I find that, while I obviously understand the affinities, I'm not trying to indulge in a hermeneutics of innocence here, as Lacerda puts it when reading Nietzsche. I do, however, think that when thought through to its conclusion, Nietzsche's philosophy is not an anti-modernist philosophy. And the kind of myth-making in fascism is essentially an anti-modernism that regresses to some kind of backwards-looking myth that never really existed, but is a kind of fantasy about return to nature that is realized in these moments of violence. And then I think that the kind of myth-making that Bataille or Artaud are engaging in has to do with this moment of the limit experience. In the case of Artaud, and just to speak, personally, because Artaud, somebody what we were discussing before, is someone I've been thinking about in this project on Nietzsche and madness that I'm working on. Personal experience of madness as instances of running up against the limits of reason, of having experiences that you can't explain, but feel a need to kind of reconstruct afterwards, that you worry your delusions, but nonetheless have enduring significance for you. I think both Bataille and Artaud, obviously Artaud much more famously in terms of, his reported writings, extensively reported his experiences of delusions of this sort. And I think one of the difficulties that you have in that position is that negotiating that paradox epistemically is often unhealthy, subject to failure, trying to assign absolute reality to whether something is a delusion, or trying to decide once and for all whether some kind of delusion of madness is an error that needs to be rejected or has significance. It's actually, I think, arguably much more therapeutic to adopt an aesthetic standpoint of what practically works to prevent dysfunction in most enable joy and affirmation in life. And I would argue that Nietzsche's concept of aesthetic justification is arising out of that kind of experience, a kind of genuine feeling for him in his life of reaching the limits of his ability to master his body and the symptoms his sickness presented, the fact that it severely limited how much he could work, the way in which he was subject to extremities of mood that often affected how productive he was in his writing, also affected his view of the world, and always worrying that signs and symptoms of depression might contaminate his ability to affirm life. I think aesthetic justification, what I'm calling aesthetic justification, is something that arises out of our honest attempts to make those kinds of situations intelligible to us in a way that we can live with them and not succumb to sickness and dysfunction. And I think that's sort of the authentic source of what we see as aesthetic, what we can see as myth making and aesthetic justification, that at the limits of when we have an intense need for a deep existential meaning, some kind of profound existential explanation for some profound pain in existence. And we find that science or knowledge as it exists runs up against its limits in satisfying that need. The idea of aesthetic myth making, I think, then comes in to make sense of a kind of limit experience, to kind of creatively and speculatively construct our best account of the universe as we understand it, not against the facts or the science, but also being willing to leap imaginatively beyond them in ways that might better suit our overall flourishing as humans.
I'm going to put forward two political figures and writers of Nietzsche right now who I believe have opposing views for sure, but kind of exist at opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of the hermeneutics of Nietzsche, which is Georg Lukács, the Marxist thinker on the one hand, and also Massimo Cacciari. Have you read Cacciari? Are you familiar with that essay?
I have not. No, no, I have
So we
not.
got to get you Cacciari pilled, as the kids say.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
but one of the claims, I mean, I'll try to sort of wrap up Cacciari's claims into like a tight little bundle here. I think what you were saying earlier about what's positive within Nietzsche's work, if, for example, we're coming from a left wing political perspective, one of the things that is redeemable nonetheless about Nietzsche's work is that it gives us a sort of armature through which to pursue these aesthetic projects that may or may not have an extra political or an even unpolitical dimension to them, that they, as you said, would kind of ride on the fringe of politics. Of course, a concern there is on, going to somebody like Lukács, is that what happens in such spaces exists or operates outside of a political totality. And given its either unpolitical or perhaps anti political bent, runs the risk of becoming a kind of irrationalism or fascism. I'd actually like to start with Lukács's view first. So let's figure out, like, what does Lukács say about Nietzsche's irrationalism? And despite our shared affinities for Nietzsche's work, is there anything right about what Lukács says? And maybe where do you think does his critique fall short?
Yeah, so I mean, Lukács most famously makes these arguments about Nietzsche's irrationalism and the destruction of reason, in which he kind of lumps Nietzsche together with a bunch of disparate thinkers, all kind of under the label of irrationalism, from Henri Bergson to William James to Heidegger. And I think there's a kind of general set of kind of collective affinities that he identifies among these irrationalists. One is an emphasis on a faculty of intuition that can't be explicated discursively, that provides some kind of privileged access to reality. And the flip side of that would be denying that ordinary rational means are adequate to reaching or grasping the world as it truly is. And for Lukács, this is because Nietzsche has what he calls an aristocratic epistemology. And you can see the kernel of that in this idea of some kind of privileged mystical access to reality, that perhaps only a privileged elite will have true access to reality in this aristocratic epistemology. And therefore, this will confer sort of privileged social or political status in them as well. And for Lukács, this is directly opposed to the kind of universalistic promise of the radical Enlightenment, the idea of reason as a common human property, and therefore I guess I would describe it as the publicity of reason. This is not the publicness of reason. This is not a word that Lukács would use. It's not far too liberal. But the idea of publicity capturing the fact that it is available and open to or visible to all, right? Rather than acquiring some kind of special faculty or special sense, such as intellectual intuition. So I would argue that there are a few problems with Lukács's account from an exegetical standpoint. There's very little real engagement with Nietzsche's epistemological views. But I think more broadly, what he's saying applies most clearly to Birth of Tragedy in Nietzsche's early work, when he adopts a very strong form of what some in the Nietzsche literature have called the falsification thesis. Particularly comes from Marie Clark's book, Nietzsche and Tragedy Philosophy. And the falsification thesis basically says that there's something about either human senses or human concepts, one of the two or both, that falsifies the fundamental nature of reality as soon as it produces a kind of experience for us. And there are different ways in which Nietzsche might cash this out, but one way that at least in Lukács's view, would be then to say that the essence of reality is unknowable according to the categories of discursive reason. And what that means is that it can be accessed only in these kind of affective, irrational aesthetic states. So the Dionysian passion that dissolves the boundaries of the subject in the Bacchic orgy or what have you, right? The fury of desire. This suspension of irrational faculties. I think this is a fair characterization of certain parts of Birth of Tragedy. But I think there are a few reasons why it's wrong as a description of Nietzsche's overall and his mature philosophy, and really a description of his thought as early as Human all too human and kind of the emerging middle works, where he really is starting to immerse himself in aspects of natural science and use the available empirical evidence of psychology or biology or what have you to try to debunk metaphysical superstitions like the free will. And this is that I think Lukács doesn't properly appreciate the way in which Nietzsche is responding to Kantian philosophy here and the terms that are fundamentally set down by Kantian philosophy regarding not just the limits of reason, but the conditions under which reason is validated in its claim to know objects of experience and know the world. And for Kant, famously, we have to sacrifice knowledge to make room for faith when it comes to absolute metaphysical ideas, such as God, the immortal soul, the free will, what have you. That concepts of the understanding can be guaranteed to apply to the objects of possible experience, but these are appearances, not things in themselves. So there's a way in which you can see that maybe Kant is falling prey to the kind of irrationalism that Lukács is warning about, and that he's affirming the idea that a thing in itself is fundamentally beyond knowledge. And this will, of course, be a huge problem in post-Kantian philosophy. And one solution to it will be Hegel's speculative idealism, which instead reaffirms thought's capacity to, through speculative reason, know the absolute in a developmental way, right? The dialectical development way. But I think what Nietzsche is responding to is something a little different. Nietzsche, we know, read the Critique of Judgment, at least major parts of the Critique of Judgment. And I think he's much more sensitive to the contrast that Kant draws between concepts and intuitions. And the appeal to intuition here, I don't read as a kind of irrationalism, but something is very Kantian when Kant says concepts without intuitions are empty and intuitions without concepts are blind. So for Kant, there's this basic distinction between the receptive intuitive faculty that perceives appearances, perceives the sensory products of the world, and the understanding faculty, which synthesizes these according to certain conceptual discursive rules. And it's important for Kant, two things are important. One, that intuition is of a sort that it can harmonize with our concepts. We couldn't have knowledge if our intuitive perceptions of the world were fundamentally chaotic and disordered. One thing just always changed to another the next second, right? Then nothing would be stable enough for our concepts to really latch onto. Our intuition has to be as such of a kind of nature that it can be synthesized, it can harmonize with concepts, yet it remains distinct from the operation of concepts. Conceptual reason thinks something that is other than what it is, right? And one way of making sense of the concept of the thing in itself is really to Kant's effort to still retain this idea that his idealist critique has to vindicate the answerability of knowledge to the empirical world, right? To something mind independent, right? And Nietzsche will radicalize this in an important way. He's going to extend this kind of perspectival appearance world down into the very fundaments of not just organic and biological existence, but arguably even inorganic existence. But the reason I call attention to the Critique of Judgment is that it offers a kind of different solution than the Hegelian speculative solution to this problem, how we harmonize intuitions and concepts. There's this basic idea that imagination is able to synthesize experience in a way that is both independent from concepts, from the rule of concepts, but also still spontaneously harmonious with concepts. And that moments of beauty in Kant's third critique are those in which we experience in the form of a feeling, our imagination and understanding spontaneously harmonize. And that if it weren't possible for the spontaneous harmony to occur, no conceptual determinate harmony through reason would ever be possible either. I tend to think, and there's a book by R. Kevin Hill called Nietzsche's Critiques that makes this argument in detail. I tend to think that Nietzsche was influenced by this idea of aesthetic reflective judgment in Kant. And if so, I think it makes his epistemology not into this irrationalist rejection of reason's ability to know the world, but really an attempt to think through this problem that we are inevitably are fated to think about reality in conceptual terms, but that reality remains a fundamentally non-identical element, and that some kind of figurative order must already be present at the level of intuition and or the imagination for us to ever subsume particulars under concepts in the first place. And I think it's that attempt at a synthesis and that Nietzsche is really trying to think through in this his kind of post-Kantian and posing ultimately in his case post-Hegelian. And that's why I think he graduates beyond just Schopenhauer's very simplistic idea of intellectual intuition early on, and thus graduates beyond most of the kind of irrationalism that Lukács criticizes. to what I take to be a much more sensitive thinking through of this fundamental problem in Kantian philosophy of the conditions under which concepts and intuitions synthesize and can harmonize.
This is something that has been lingering in my mind now for a while. It's the difference between what we would call perhaps living an aesthetic existence. And here I'm thinking about the thinker James Hillman in particular, who espoused this view that our existential enrichment in this world derives from finding soul, psyche within the world by seeing beauty, seeing through appearances in a way, and chasing the imagination in ways that are often either preempted or blocked by our rational schemas. How is that then different, for example, with comparison to what the fascist is doing, where they're making the political aesthetic? And here I see, through your description of Kant, it almost buttresses what I believe is a fundamental difference in this relationship towards aesthetics, where in the case of Hillman, for example, it's beyond the breach of rationality that we can get this kind of richness that lies outside of the political. I wonder if you have a more sophisticated view of that, or if you've thought through a similar problem.
I wish I had a more sophisticated view. No, I mean, I think this. So when we talk about the fascists, I guess this is the way that I came to think about this when I was thinking through these questions of the aesthetic while working on my dissertation, which is that the fascist, particularly fascist version of the aestheticization of politics, itself hinges on this modern break in the very concept of creation of the very concept of aesthetics, where art and aesthetics come to be siphoned off from morality, come to be siphoned off from practical philosophy and from theoretical philosophy, objective knowledge of the world, into a kind of specialized activity that maybe then has to be concentrated in a kind of faculty of intuition, right? That is distinct from rational forms of knowledge. And in Gadamer's Truth and Method, I think, is the masterwork of this argument, where he sort of charts how an earlier, more comprehensive view in both the ancients and that kind of reemerged in the Renaissance in Europe, that integrated matters of taste into rational objective knowledge, particularly at the level of making fine-grained judgments, gave way to the scientific method as the kind of universal standard of the production of knowledge, right? And the fact that knowledge about art and knowledge about aesthetics can't live up to that standard, therefore creates a kind of sharp division between the artistic and aesthetic realm and the realm of morality, and also the realm of objective knowledge. And I think that when Benjamin describes the aestheticization of politics in the work of Art and the Age of Myth of the Reproduction, it is then this attempt to reclaim the lost aura of art, right? Out of the standpoint of recognizing that it is lost, right? But not having a kind of critical account of the origins of that loss and how to go about rectifying it. And I think when Benjamin opposes the politicization of art to the aestheticization of politics, what I think of is there is a distinction between ways in which we can aesthetically reimagine our practical activities in everyday existence versus that intersect with our practical commitments, that intersect with our moral commitments, versus taking either politics or the state as such as an art object. And that kind of, to go to your book, Anti-Oculus, the kind of the gaze of the modern artist, right, who sees the artwork as this pure creation of a pure aesthetic will, right, that emerges out of a romantic return to nature. In some sense, if you follow Gadamer, that was only possible after the art had already been emptied out of its pre-existing practical and moral significance and detached into this merely aesthetic thing. And only once you had art for art's sake could then art in aesthetics parasitically and destructively reattach itself to politics in the fascist form. And so the contrast with that would be to reimagine, and this would be where I was trying to contrast aesthetic judgment as an activity of persuasion and exemplification, thinking about ways in which, and to go back to this question about the edges of politics, thinking about the way philosophical figures like Diogenes, for example, was able to practice an aesthetics, a radical aesthetics of existence. That was a stylization of his life, as Foucault talks about, that exemplifies his own absolute commitment to a certain form of morality, right? The total renunciation of material goods, living in naked in public and all of that, but also empowers him then to launch this fearless critique of the political in his confrontation with Alexander the Great, right? And that kind of mode of like aesthetic exemplification, like when I was working on my dissertation, those are the kind of things that I was trying to think about as like philosophical and aesthetic forms of life that stylize intensely practical and ordinary forms of existence in a kind of radical authenticity or honesty that then enables the fearless critique of power, and that of power and its hypocrisy. And that, admittedly is a limited vision. It's a vision that is kind of a basis for certain kind of artistic and aesthetic practices rather than a mass politics, and obviously has to be joined to a mass politics. But I would argue, that I feel strongly that this is where Marxist materialism often reaches its limits, and where we circle back to the idea of tragedy, that I certainly experience ourselves to be living through a tragic time, whether it's through having to witness horrifying crimes being committed throughout the world, or having extreme despair over the ravages of capitalism and what they're doing to the natural world, that could even reach the point where we despair about the future of human civilization, about the viability of human life on Earth. And I think it is in these situations that we will increasingly, especially as the harms of climate change intensify, we will increasingly find ourselves confronting some of these fundamental existential problems about the justification of our own human activities and how we might be able to rethink them in a fundamental way. And I don't have a good answer today for how that's joined to mass politics. But I do have the concern that not taking this tragic dimension seriously, but not taking the failure of hopes of a straightforwardly materialist and productivist politics of Marxism in the 20th century seriously, and also taking seriously people's need for some kind of aesthetic myth-making when the future of humanity is radically open and radically uncertain, and where we do both have a need to positively reimagine it as something that isn't an inevitable apocalypse, but also have faced significant lack of knowledge in our ability to predict where the future is going to go. And I do think it may not be it can never be the essence of politics as such, but in these moments where the chips are down, as it were, we do find ourselves in confrontation with tragic scenarios. I think it's indispensable for retaining some kind of hope in the future and envisioning a positive future without simply descending into the kind of resentment and infighting that would prevent any kind of constructive action to begin with.
Maybe one more question on the politics angle is with respect to art too. Do you believe then that there's a risk in entertaining a romantic tendency insofar as it prefigures art to be political in some way, or that it emphasizes primordiality, origins, and so forth, versus something like Deleuze would say, or Deleuze and Guattari and What is Philosophy, where entry into an aesthetic space is more about entering a zone of indiscernibility rather than having this sort of prefigured epistemological contours known in advance. I mean, I'd like you to talk more about the romantic angle because we did an interview with Patrick Iden-Oaf, who did an excellent book on the poetry of class. And he talks about Lukács's return to romanticism, or at least a vindication of it at the end of his life, after the whole socialist realism debacle and the critiques of Brecht and so forth. But I'm curious where you see the role of romanticism, especially with respect to Nietzsche, who disavows Wagner as a kind of romantic too. And there's a trajectory in Nietzsche's life away from that romantic tendency as well.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, it's something that comes up in the preface to The Birth of Tragedy, where he makes comments sharply distinguishing even the comments there from kind of Wagnerian romanticism. And I think one of the fundamental questions here is whether there's any kind of simple return to to a mythic past, or return to some kind of romanticized unity with nature, and whether instinct and intuition express that kind of, let's say, something similar to Freud's kind of regression into infancy, in a return to the kind of primary process of instinct, as it were. I do think that, as we've discussed for various reasons, that Nietzsche rejects that in favor of something closer to what you're describing with Deleuze and a zone of indiscernibility. The focus of the aesthetic practices we tend to think of Nietzsche as an affirmative thinker, which is correct. But it's also important to keep in mind the extent to which the extent to which he demands we engage in activity of Tabaro's, for post terms of getting free of ourselves, and thus problematizing the ways in which we, in the life that we live, whether it's our practices or the ways that we think about our identities, our projects, our society, are shaped by decadence, are shaped by this history of inherited metaphysical ideas that for Nietzsche are not only bankrupt, but serve to make us unhealthy as human beings. So there is a significant negative moment here in the sense of a kind of ruthless critique of the claim that those structures make upon our lives, that therefore does not go in any kind of anticipated direction, can't return to the kind of romantic stable ground of the unconscious or the deep kind of soulful connection to nature that you allow to express yourself. It has to venture out into this territory of the kind of infinite sea, as Nietzsche often envisions it, which we find ourselves in only because we have decisively detached ourselves from certain kinds of nostalgic romantic attachments and accepted that certain aspects of a natural scientific picture of the world have robbed it of forms of metaphysical or religious meaning that we previously assigned to it. And we might have previously assigned being woven supernaturally into the objective nature of reality. But I do still think that and I guess this is a way, I hope this isn't too off topic, but this is the way I can think to address it is, and I know you have significant interest in Jung and Hillman. And one thing that strikingly contrasts them to me with Deleuze in Deleuze and Guattari, particularly in Anti-Oedipus, is their rejection of this kind of mythological model. And particularly the way they see it is attached to an idea of the unconscious as signifying or symbolizing rather than being productive, right? And I think that this maybe goes too far, and that Nietzsche does affirm some element of romanticism in the sense that in a kind of mad, manic moment, particularly towards the end of his life, where he is signing letters as Dionysus, these kind of mythic symbols become almost these creative mobile signifiers that he combines in new constellations to kind of inject into various different philosophical questions that he is trying to address. And I think that that's something, from my own experiences and from the project I'm working on now, people who are in psychotic episodes, people who are experiencing madness very frequently find themselves appealing to these kind of religious and mythological signifiers and symbols. But I think Deleuze is correct. They do function as these kind of mobile vehicles for the production of desire, for making connections, rather than forms of kind of representational identity that we are kind of, and so I guess I would see, still some ground for reclaiming mythic symbols in that sense, as a kind of creative terrain of the unconscious. But our guide for that is probably not the romantic, but the genuine madman in the asylum who has followed that path so much that it has threatened dysfunctionality of work. Right. That might be the kind of that I think is a better picture of the confrontation that Nietzsche attempts, which would be a decisive break with all kind of nostalgia of past romanticism, but one that has incredible dangers and uncertainties, and for Nietzsche, ended in disaster. This kind of experiments in myth making.
Yeah, this is, I would say, one of the most important questions in my general research, and my mediators being Hillman, Deleuze, and Nietzsche in particular. And I mean, I would put Carl Jung in there as well, but I don't think I need him for the time being to sort of elaborate. My concern here is, I think it's interesting that in Anti-Oedipus, that's where they reject myth, but it's also in a chapter earlier where they write that something like archetypes populate on the body without organs.
Yes, exactly. The Nietzsche's "I am every name in history" comment,
Yeah,
quote that, there'll be these voices that populate the unconscious as productive forces or desire machines rather than representational signifiers, right?
right. And I think I would amend that view partially. I mean, some of those names are Artemis, Hercules, and so forth. But I think there's a big risk if we have something like mythology registered trademark, where now our imagination is constrained to these figures that come from the Hellenic world, for example. And, there's this impulse to make recourse to this canonized pantheon of figures. I think one of the things that Hillman in particular licenses us to do is to think archetypally, but first and foremost, to develop a relationship with the image that is more sensate, that puts you in that Deleuzian realm of the zone of indiscernibility, such that we're able to construct maybe, I mean, maybe we are constructing our own archetypes, but that there can be an utterly different and pronounced character to any given image, whether it's in our artistic creation, whether it's in reverie or fantasy and so forth. And it's something that we work with that has a kind of intimacy that isn't reducible to this set figuration of mythology.
Yeah, I think I would even go further to say that like the only real access we can have to mythology would be through defamiliarizing ourselves
Interesting.
with it, in the sense that we have inherited it as we have inherited you know, I like Wittgenstein when he says, you know, a picture held us captive, and we couldn't get outside of it because it lay in our language. I think it's true also of mythology, and he makes similar comments. We have a certain picture of mythology as it attempts to offer supernatural explanations of natural phenomena. And in some sense, this is a picture that we've only inherited from modernity that I think distorts the function that myth really had in human life, psychologically and emotionally. But I would say for that reason, it's really only through encountering a multiplicity of mythologies and understanding the ways in which certain figures of gods that might have an established identity for you in a particular pantheon, historical pantheon that you're familiar with. I think it's useful to put those in some sense into confrontations with different iterations and different figures and different pantheons to, as I said, defamiliarize yourself with what kind of position within the mythic constellation a certain figure plays. And I think, you know, Nietzsche kind of draws connection. I think that can allow kind of productive ways in which we see that, you know, mythic symbols form a kind of unconscious constellation that is embedded in our language, that's embedded in our grammar, and thus forms something potentially, in my view, potentially universal, right? And that the way we can get to that universalism won't be falsely universalizing whatever kind of mythology deeply resonates with us or we have inherited, but making a genuine aesthetic effort to recover kind of universal human mythology on the basis of multiplicity, and precisely by subjecting our own kind of inherited one to a kind of critique of exposure to human difference. So, and there's some sense, if I were to make an optimistic point, the kind of return to a mythology that would not deny all of human knowledge, but for Nietzsche, incorporate all of it in a new way, would theoretically only be possible once we've reached a state of kind of truly globalized existence, where we're able to view human culture as kind of historical totality, perhaps.
I think you'd really appreciate Hillman because part of his definition of pathology is not one that engenders a kind of lack, but really refers to a kind of differencing. I mean, even in the most sort of banal understanding, like getting the common cold is
Mhm.
pathological, and it's a kind of differencing in the sense that there's an entity at odds with the whole that I know myself to be. With that said, our creative imagination, as it produces dreams and reveries and so forth, whenever we are struck by that image that is so pronounced that, you know, just lingers in our mind all morning, afternoon, and night, and that which maybe like, you know, sort of taps the well of depression, as it did for me when I was in my early 20s. It was like
Mhm.
a serious dream that brought on just this malaise. And it's in those moments that a kind of differencing takes place. It's uncomfortable and it puts us in that heterogeneous realm. It puts us in the domain of the tragic, at least in my view. And it occurs as a kind of differencing. But with that said, maybe we'll end the conversation on a discussion of pathology, at least in the sense of mental illness and psychopathology. Your blog, Methods of Madness, is an exploration of this topic. And I was wondering if you could just give us some final comments on the aesthetic justification on life as it pertains to your research and experience with mental illness.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you asking about the topic, because I think that one cost of being the left Nietzschean on Twitter is that everybody asks me about politics immediately, and you know is less interested in some of the other aspects of the project. Um, yeah, I mean the project on Nietzsche is largely inspired by my own experiences with psychosis. I have bipolar disorder and was diagnosed when I was 28. And this was right in the middle of grad school for me. I was in a period of intense work on my dissertation where I stayed up several nights straight in an intense manic episode, and ended up having to be hospitalized throughout the psychotic episode. And after that, there was a crash and then a long process of recovery, but it's something that I've grappled with ever since. I had repeated psychotic experiences over the years. I would say at least 10 or 11 since then. One of which required hospitalization, most of which I've been able to navigate safely with the help of my wife and family and friends. But I, started to, after I had those experiences and they really disrupted my plans to become an academic or really feel like I could produce anything in my writing, I ended up seeing Nietzsche as a way to productively work through these struggles that I was having and making sense of not just my disorder or condition, but also the actual content of the experiences that I've had. Because I think most people who have had particularly a manic psychotic experience will really very similar stories about kind of this intense ecstasy, feeling of a profound universal meaning, ideas of being chosen, just the general sense of exaltation and reaching for and being in contact with some kind of transcendent meaning. And it can be extremely difficult when you come back to ordinary existence, especially if these experiences recur. You find yourself in a state of wondering what's a delusion and wondering what constitutes a lucid perception of reality. And when I started rereading Nietzsche again around this time, I was struck by how much I thought Nietzsche also grappled with similar kinds of problems, and I began to see ways in which his experiences of madness were refracted back into earlier works. And that we couldn't really assign, while there was certainly a final breakdown in Turin that Nietzsche did recover from, that we couldn't cleanly separate his experiences of madness from the rest of his philosophy. And I was sort of inspired by some more recent work in the philosophy of on the philosophy of madness that really starts to try to unpack these experiences from the standpoint of the person who has psychosis, rather than from a psychiatric objectifying standpoint. And I think to bring this back to pathology, I do think that that this is really at the center of what I'm trying to work through in my project with Nietzsche and what I write about on the Substack, which is that I want to reject, and I think it's important to reject, a certain psychiatric language of pathology, a certain pathology paradigm that treats mental illness as a disease that's analogous to physical disease in a certain way, in the sense that it can be identified as specific cause that we can cleanly detach from, for example, social conditions and the sort, and also involves some kind of basic defect that has to be corrected. So from my standpoint, it became just, from my everyday struggle, what mattered from a disorder standpoint was I going to end up in the hospital, right? The question of whether it was a pathology and disorder was, well, is this actually going to interfere with my function? And I think the turn for me was realizing that I still get to define what constitutes well functioning for me, as long as I am not harming, the people in my family by putting myself in the hospital. But also that focusing on this practical question of what narratives enable my functionality, what narratives about these experiences enable my health and functionality, what narratives impede that. I found myself in where that was much more helpful as a way of articulating therapeutic options for dealing with the disorder than the idea of trying to assign reality or non-reality to certain delusions and the kind of pathological thinking that the pathologizing that entails. And I found that I don't think psychiatry has good resources for people who have psychotic experiences. I think it's one of the areas that's still heavily stigmatized, and where you will still find psychiatrists whose considered opinion will be, well, if you have terrible psychosis, you're just consigned to a life of incarceration, right? And that's not a reality that I think any person who has these experiences ought to accept. I do think we need to fundamentally reconsider what role these kinds of altered experiences of altered reality play in revealing certain features of the structure of human cognition, the structure of human experience of the world, in understanding the kind of diversity of different cognitive frames that people have that human beings have for approaching the world. And that's what the project is really about. Is I'm working on a more kind of comprehensive kind of exegesis on Nietzsche's work that kind of creates a full narrative of kind of how his philosophy evolves in relation to experiences of both physical and mental illness throughout his life. But I think, this is also the area that I come back to as something that I found Nietzsche especially powerful for and useful for thinking. Even if I think that Nietzsche's own attempts to kind of, as he put it, be his own physician, failed in many cases, ended catastrophically. There's still a great deal we can learn from his creative and artistic attempt to transfigure a life of illness without epistemic guarantees.
Well, Devin, I just want to say thanks for coming on the first interview on this channel. You were the appropriate guest for this. And I think this topic,
I'm honored. Thank you.
and this is a topic that I've wanted to talk about for quite some time. So if you want to hear more of Devin, I will have a link to Moral Minority in the show notes. Also, a link to Devin's Substack, Methods of Madness. Please subscribe and visit him there. And is there anything else that you want to plug or say before we sign off, Devin?
No, I mean, that's what I'm working on right now. Definitely give the podcast Moral Minority to listen. It's a little bit of a different topic. We talk about questions of moral philosophy and moral foundations, different like meta-ethical positions for justifying morality. But you can see how that's also connected to what we talked about today. But yeah, this was a great discussion. As I said, I'm honored that you made me your first guest on the channel. Really, thank you. And it was a great conversation.
Oh, great. Thank you.